Greetings, Darklings, from across the interweb. It is once again I, the Duchess, Precious Ken, here for the Sounds and Shadows podcast. And I have a really, really exciting guest. I'm not going to do any unboxings. I'm not going to do any shout outs of albums coming out at the beginning because I want to get right to it. We got a lot to talk about. I have none other than John Robb of Membranes, the prolific band, runs a much bigger website than mine to talk about it and more, and has a new book out, The History of Goth, which I just finished reading. Is absolutely exceptional in its depth, research, but more than that, the soul of it is what really got me, that it felt like a novel when I'm reading about clubs back in the 70s and the beginning in the 80s, in Leeds and other places. You smell it, you taste the air, you feel it's there by the descriptions. And as somebody who is 45 now, so never would have had a chance to see Joy Division in 77, it feels a little bit like I was there. So it is my extreme pleasure to welcome John. John, welcome to the show.
Hello, it's good to be here.
So we have a lot of ground to cover, and I can't wait to talk to you about all this. But one of the questions I really like to start out with so that people can get an idea of you is, there was this moment, whether it was a show you went to, a record that you put on, something you saw or heard that hit your heart with this darkness that is the goth scene and goth music, and said to you, this is something that I want to be a part of. You were enthralled with music then. What was that moment for you in your history that really got you to dive into post-punk, punk, goth music?
Well, actually, because I'm older than you, so it was a bit more. Yeah, so it's a bit more of a morph, really. It was. I grew up with glam rock in the 70s, so that was very prevailing culture in England, because the biggest TV show for pop music was Top of the Pops. There's always Bowie was on there, T-Rex, and even the other glam bands, which aren't as hip, but I loved as well. That Sweet, Slade, I loved all that stuff. It was great. And then after that, there was punk, so I got massively into punk. And then you didn't really know, it wasn't like an overnight thing. It wasn't suddenly, let's get into goth next or whatever.
Sure.
It's just like another version of punk, because punk fractured into all these other different scenes. Right. And that was alternative music. For about 2 years, it was called alternative music, or it wasn't even called post-punk at the time, because nobody realised we were outside punk. It just felt like punk was developing to all these other different things. And one of them was a darker strand, which is part of one of the things you liked, So it wasn't like when Bela Lugosi's Dead came out, which you could sort of count as being the first goth record. Sure. There was stuff before that felt goth. I mean, the first Banshees album or Joy Division had a darkness. It was darker than music that you're used to hearing from before. I mean, there have been like dystopian darker records, Bowie's Berlin records, or The Doors. I mean, The Doors are very. in fact, the first band to actually be called a goth or a gothic band was The Doors. So it wasn't like, I don't think it was an overnight thing. It wasn't. If you talk about in terms of punk, you could say the Bill Grundy interview in England, or when the Pistols put out Anarchy in UK, or the Damned in New Rose. It's very definable staging posts in that culture where things kind of flip from one to another. But goth was a slow kind of more, it came in drips and drabs. It wasn't like overnight everything suddenly became a completely different scene. It was just like the shades of darkness got darker.
I love that. And I think that makes sense, because maybe where punk rock, kicked in the door and came straight at you, goth would have to creep in around you from the shadows.
Yeah, and I think, none of the bands are actually goth bands, were they? None of the bands would ever think of themselves being goth. I mean, they kind of, there's a duality to this, isn't there? Because they don't mind having a goth audience, but they don't see themselves as being goth bands. So if you speak to people like Bauhaus see themselves as being a punk band. Right. I think Susie very much sees herself as being from punk, because she was from punk, wasn't she? I mean, that was, with the band when they started, they came out of a punk festival. They played punk gigs, but it was just a different shade of punk, really. And then, or Kill and Joke as well. I mean, there's so many. I mean, this is another debate, isn't it? But what do you actually count as a goth band, and what would you call a discernible goth band? But so what I would do, and what I did in the book was, goth culture in England was very much based in the clubs. It was bands whose records you could play in clubs, and a lot of music before hadn't, punk. You didn't get punk clubs where you would dance on a dance floor. That just didn't really happen. But there was an explosion of goth clubs across Britain. Well, they're all alternative clubs initially, and so bands like Killing Joke, you had to be able to dance to it, and they had a funk, which punk did not have a funk at all. Punk was about raw energy, and goth was about dance music. And I like that thing where it gets fused with disco and it gets fused with funk and dub. It's all mixed in there, and it's a lot of black music mixing in with rock music. And these are things that people don't often talk about, isn't it? You read articles on goth music, and nobody ever talks about the dance floor and the idea of the clubs. So that's why the book starts the club thing. And the groups I covered in the separate chapters, nearly all of them were what you would hear in a goth club. So in a sense, as you read the book, you're almost reading the playlist of an late 70s, early 80s kind of British kind of goth club. So I mean, Killing Joke never really looked like a goth band, but you'd always hear them in goth clubs. Follow the Leaders was a goth club classic.
Oh, yeah.
And the fringe bands as well, like Einstein's and Neubart. I mean, obviously that wouldn't fill a dance floor, but it was definitely informing the scene. I mean, I'm sure Blixer Barger would be completely baffled if you said he was in a goth band. But if you look at a picture of Blixer from 40 years ago, he looks more goth than anybody.
Right. It's funny. I just did an interview with Mona Muir, and was kind of talking about Berlin in those days and hanging out with Neubauten, and really kind of got me on the idea of how that scene was more punk than ever. She never considered herself industrial or kind of, she thought of herself more as a punk, and so did they. And I kind of love that you say that that's how they viewed themselves as a band.
Yeah, I think it's just different shades of punk. I think it's how people reacted to punk, and everybody reacted in different ways. So in a way, what they brought into punk in the first place, the pre-punk influences, punk sort of empowered them to play those influences out, didn't they? So yeah. If you were into darker vibes before punk, you could use the energy of punk. They gave you a space to go and create that, and in a way, yeah, post-punk and especially goth was all basically 16, 17-year-olds up and down the country creating, before all these people hadn't been in bands, had no opportunity to be in a band. The punks would go and do it, and they did it, but they did it in their own terms. They didn't, I mean, yes, there were carbon copy punk bands, but most people went off in a completely different direction, brought in the stuff that, if they were big Bowie heads before, they brought in their version of Bowie, a simpler version or whatever, but they brought it in, and that was interesting about punk. It was a tear in the fabric, and everyone got through. And the one that once they got through, they go, "What do we do now? Well, let's just carry on." so, and I think the darkness was it because everyone was really morose and depressed, even though the backdrop in the UK,
right,
especially, was pretty broken at the time. A bit like it is now. Actually, the weather's always rubbish, and it's and the government's always rubbish, and there's not a lot of opportunities for a lot of people. I mean, that was in there, but it wasn't like everybody went to a club and stood around looking really miserable. It was fun. People are good. People could, there's a duality. People could embrace the darkness and enjoy the melancholy, but also have a good time doing it. They could dance to the misery.
Right. No, and as somebody who is widely considered to be a pretty happy-go-lucky goth, I always, say that it isn't just about, the misery. It's about seeing the world in spectrums and the way that it is, and people are complicated, and you can be more than one thing and express that darkness. So
yeah, isn't one of the great strands of goth is seeing the beauty in the darkness as well, isn't it? It's a lot of these goth clubs were in really broken towns, where there was nothing glamorous ever happened in these towns, and it's always people sort of saying this town is it's knackered or whatever, but we're going to create the glamour. And that's why I start the book with the description of people, the couple going to the club. It's
right.
It's the rain-swept cobbled streets. That's what it was like. That's no romantic notion. And how dangerous it was to dress up in those kind of places. But they brought the glamour to the streets. The glamour, the catwalks of London were transplanted to like broken northern towns or satellite towns of London, or or Northampton, where Bauhaus come from. I mean, nothing ever came out of Bauhaus, but Northampton before that, it was a really boring town. And I don't. There must have been about 8 people in that town into cool stuff, and somehow 4 of them ended up in one band. It's and they created something out of a vacuum. This is pre-internet, so young people under 40 would say, "Well, why didn't you just look it all up on Google?" But you couldn't then. You had to actually you had to make it all up out of a vacuum. There's very few reference points. One there, we had a great radio show in England. John Peel in the evening would play really esoteric records of mainstream radio. And that was important. The music papers were a driver because they were weekly. They were big, about 100 pages, and it was a big chunks of information. But it wasn't like the internet. Like now you could just learn every song ever written. You can look up all its chord shapes, can't you? But then you had to work it all out. I'm not saying that's better or worse. That's just how it was.
So I love that you brought that up, and the intro of the book, kind of like I said, one of the things that drew me in right off the bat is your description and kind of letting us in that world, especially those of us younger, that seeing that scene through your eyes and seeing it. A big part of that, you talked about the aesthetic and the look and where that came from, and going back with punk like Malcolm McLaren and Sex, the Store and whatnot, being a part of the punk aesthetic, but also this goth aesthetic that changed it. And tell me, because nowadays, as you said, everything is so fractured and we have a million subgenres and everybody wants to try and describe what is or isn't goth. And I think it's important now because people say, if you're just in it for the fashion, you don't really understand the goth scene if it isn't the music that drew you in. But back then, I feel like it was a lot the opposite. Like I knew a lot of people in the 90s when I was coming into it that knew everything about goth music and the history, but just didn't want to dress the part or do it. And they would get called out and kind of, called posers and whatnot. So what do you feel was the importance of kind of that tribalism or dress, or when you're going to these early clubs, that the DIY aesthetic of goth played in building that early scene?
I think the first important thing here is that no one person could define a culture. It's just your take on the culture.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying I'm an expert on it. I'm just saying what I see in front of me and what I feel personally.
Sure. So but you were there. That is the other big difference.
Yeah, I mean that's true, but it doesn't make me the judge. Like I say, who is it, who isn't, and I think it's such a weird notion. I mean, I think because it's a lot of people get into these things when they're young, when they're teenagers,
right.
And sometimes that teenage mentality is there 40 years later. What it's very strict when it has to be and when it has not to be. And this is why a lot of the bands really hate it. This is why someone like Andrew Eldritch has spent his whole life trying to deny he's got anything to do with goth.
Yes.
Because in a sense, because he's a very intelligent guy and he has no time for people creating parameters for how he should be, when he should release records, what he should look like or whatever. That's his decision, isn't it? And I think when you start putting rules in it, I mean, the whole point of getting into music culture is get away from all the rules, surely, all the strictures of normal life. People go to work and get told what to do all day. You don't want to go out at night to get told what to do by another set of people. So people want to dress up or not want to dress up or listen to one record, another record. But it doesn't matter. Just all go in a room and enjoy it. You're all loosely joined together, aren't you? It's not like going to a redneck bar, is it? Or like a normal club in town. Surely the best kind of space is where there's kind of a free expression within like a vibe, and it's kind of that vibe because it's kind of the music. It's got that darkness in it, but it's also you could dance. That's all you're going to want in a club. Whether you're going to have your hair in any of 8,000 different styles does not really matter, But then the next part, the DIY thing, I thought that. I mean, coming out of punk, I'm a big fan of DIY, and I like the idea. Initially, I mean, a lot of the alternative clubs, because you couldn't buy these clothes. It wasn't like you could go in a shop and buy a black shirt that somebody put skulls all over.
Yeah, just like Google, they didn't have a hot topic or something. Like you had to figure it out yourself.
Yeah, people had to make their own stuff. And a lot of it was kind of growing out of punk. So punk was short, spiky hair, but the impact of that had gone. So people have just got it longer. So and freakier to get the same impact. I mean, even though it was dangerous walking around, every time you would get attacked, you wouldn't. It was not like you're going to brush your hair down. You grow it longer, wouldn't you? Because it's like defying it, and it's and the clothes got freakier. But a lot of the clothes are second hand. People buy them in second hand shops
Right.
and kind of make them themselves. I mean, you could get some items. Some people go to London and get stuff, because London had shops, or Manchester as well had a couple of shops at the time. Ex-Clothes actually managed by Johnny Marr. I mean, Johnny Marr was the manager of the Goth shop in Manchester when he's about 16.
I learned that today from watching one of your interviews, kind of getting ready. I love that story and learning that about Johnny Marr. That's so cool.
Well, yeah, he's a really cool guy, though, Johnny. I mean, Johnny is the ultimate encyclopedia of music. He'll tell you why he would wear a certain colour of socks to go with a certain track. His quest to get a Johnny Thunders leather jacket with white lapels on it, took him 2 years to get one because he's into his clothes. I mean, this is the other thing you have to remember. I mean, I know people in the UK, in America, dress up as well, but in the UK, for a lot of people, clothes are really important, and clothes and music has always been a constant in our culture because there is a dandy kind of element to British pop culture, from the start.
Sure.
I mean, it's not completely unique because other countries have it as well, but it's something that's very British, I think, from the Teddy Boys to the mods to
Mod, all of that
whole thing. It's about dressing sharp with very little money, making something out of nothing, trying to make some glamour where there was no glamour. And Goth, in a sense, was part of that, in those kind of smaller towns. Like I said before, you're bringing the catwalk to Keighley or Wakefield or just small sort of broken mill towns where the mills are all shut. It was trying to make something. You couldn't go to LA or Hawaii, those places that were impossible. You'd never get there. So you tried to bring some of that perceived glamour into your own place, and that was a version of it. There was other versions. I mean, punk sprinted into lots of different scenes. Psychobilly, two-tone, second wave of punk, anarcho-punk, new wave of British heavy metal, and goth. I mean, they're all coming out of that kind of energy source. It's like the universe, the Big Bang, in it, and all the, all the little solar systems pinging out of it in different directions. But there was crossovers as well, and they weren't so purist. In those clubs you could hear. Initially in the altered clubs, as they were kind of morphing into goth clubs, you would hear The Fall and bands like that as well. Bands that aren't really goth bands, but they would sound right in those clubs, So it wasn't like a strict goth playlist of only people who wore black clothes and that was it. Which it would end up like. But you find out with all cultures, don't you? They start off they're not defined, are they? And everything fits in and gradually honed down, and it can only be one thing. Like early metal is quite diverse, isn't it? Like when you listen to Led Zeppelin, they're quite funky, aren't they? But metal for years and years after that will just take the heavy bits and get rid of the funk, and it became very linear. And that happened to a certain extent in goth for a long time. But then the vibe of it kind of permeates into lots of different places, and you're interested in what the new bands were. And I love that term, trad goth. I think it's so great when people talk about old goth bands. They call it trad goth. It's so cool. And there are modern equivalents of trad goth. There are people doing modern goth music in the ideas of what the older goth bands were. But what's really interesting is the vibe of goth kind of permeates so many different cultures and musics now. There's a lot of electronic music, like people like Gazelle Twin, and she makes amazing records in England. She's not goth, but her records have a darkness which resonates with me as being quite gothic in a sense,
Sure.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's a version of, of Bauhaus. It doesn't have to be the 28th version of Bauhaus, which would be great, because Bauhaus are an amazing band. And to take that and produce something really good with it. But it can be electronic music, or it could be a film, the way Tim Burton because he was a goth when he was a kid, transplants the themes and the textures of goth into film. And this is something that I wrote the book's about. I mean, it's called The Art of Darkness, and it's mainly about that post-punk period, but extrapolated out across, hundreds of years. I like the idea that Lord Byron and the Romantic poets were goths of their time. They are dealing in dark kind of ideas in a very artful way, in a very poetic way. And now you have Instagram influencers who do photographs standing in the middle of a forest or something, dressed up in goth clothes, but no music because they're not interested in music. There's YouTube goth influencers who have no interest in music at all. So it isn't always the vibe of it can go into lots of different places, basically into novels, into books. There's lots of really good writers, novelists, young novelists in Britain who have a very Gothic atmosphere in their books. In a way, he's taking it back to where it started. He's taking it back to the 17th,
Exactly.
18th, 19th century Gothic writers, isn't it? And maybe it's, I mean, this is something I say all the time, but every generation has to deal with its blues. And, in 17th century, maybe that was writing poetry, or writing a book. And in my time, because music was so central to the culture, I mean, it was everybody was into music when I was growing up. Whereas music now is part of the culture. So, if you're 17, you're into your gaming, you may have some music on in the background,
Right.
and you may be watching Netflix at the same time as you're doing the game, because people multitask on their laptops or probably on their phones,
On
actually.
everything, right.
Yeah, while you're doing your socials at the same time. So a modern version, because the feeling never goes away, those blues are still here, but they're played out in gaming. There's lots of sort of Gothic games, or it plays out on Instagram or TikTok, and sometimes it plays out in music as well. So it's not like, if you talk about what is a Gothic culture now, it's not necessarily bands. It's not like trying everywhere, yet nowhere all at the same time.
See, I love that you say that, and I love how you talk about it coming full circle, because another place I was going with that, and the aspect is, I think in those early goth scenes, that's just it. Someone might be drawn, and it could be in the 70s as easy as the 90s, to go into a goth club as a safe space, because people were playing with gender norms, sexuality, a lot of these things where if you go to a goth club like that, you feel like you said, walking there might be terrifying. But once you get there, you are in mass and with your people and have a safe space to explore that, which then a lot of those people heard Susie and the Banshees, or Alien Sex, things playing behind. Now they're getting into the music, but that's not what drew them in the door. So I think it's important to remember to say to people today in 2023, invite these TikTok, kids that are maybe hearing that, because they might not, or Instagram might not have come in the door for any other reason beyond they like the aesthetic. But once they're there, they're going to find this music, and it's going to speak to them. Let them have a chance to do that without trying to push them out the door.
Yeah, and I think I like that idea, because it's interesting, because I don't think it was a particularly, this is a generalization, it wasn't a particularly political movement, but but the idea of a safe space, which is very true, is political, isn't it? So it's kind of, It wasn't manifesto political, but it just created a space where you could be yourself, which is a very powerful political statement, isn't it? And there was a lot of diversity, and there still is a lot of diversity in those clubs. I mean, some of the people there will be quite macho, quite tough lads, but they knew they had to like drop that when they went in there, So it's,
Right.
I think that's important, very important. I mean, there was a lot of aggression because it was a young scene then as well. It's 18, 19-year-olds, a lot of steam coming out their ears, and it's a lot of, but the aggression was directed. It's in the energy of the music and the dancing to the music and going to the gigs and also outside the clubs, following the bands around. I mean, that was the thing as well. When people going up and down the country with sleeping bags, sleeping in the bus shelters, all the crews that follow the bands around, was quite fascinating as well.
Yeah.
But the clubs there was the gender norms were getting challenged then, quite strongly actually. When it come, the men there were tough lads in there, but there's also men who weren't very macho at all, and that came out of punk as well. Punk had that kind of weird sort of thing as well, right. And the women, a lot of goth women were actually probably more macho than the guys as well, quite tough, which is cool as well, because why should any be anything? Why should like you're a bloke, you're a woman. Here's the 10 things you meant to do. Like it wasn't like when we were growing up. Like boys have blue, girls have pink. It's like, well, why?
A lot of it was all challenging what had been taught before, and saying I can do the exact opposite of that, no matter what it was.
Yeah, you just do what feels right. And that was what people felt like, which I mean, America's different than England. America in the 60s, 70s is much more expressive than this country was. You couldn't express anything, especially if you're a bloke in England, I mean, this is another very powerful thing about the music, which now people will not get the context of. but sensitivity and emotional sensitivity could only be played out in music if you were a male in England in the 60s and 70s. People could say things in music, they couldn't say things in real life. So something like Joy Division, which is incredibly sensitive, really, the music. Yeah. A lot of time lyrics are good, but it's actually the sound of his voice. There's a sensitivity to it, which cannot be expressed in normal life, whereas now people can, a bit more. I mean, but even that band, that when he was, when he was getting suicidal, the rest of the band didn't even realise. And Hooky, years later, would say when he finally got around to read the lyrics, he said, God, it was really obvious, but we had no idea.
Right.
Because Ian Curtis wouldn't walk a rehearsal room and go, oh, God, lads, I'm feeling really depressed. I'm going to kill myself. You just wouldn't do that. You would just go and kill yourself. You couldn't articulate that feeling to people. But weirdly, in the music, you could, even if people weren't really listening. But that was a space you could do it in. And that was the power.
I think that's a great example there when you talk about Ian Curtis and Joy Division, because for me, that was a big deal. And I'm sure for you, like I said, even before that, but that's just it. I think that's why it resonates so much, where if you ask bands in the 80s, the 90s, 2000, a lot of big bands will always say, what are your influences? Joy Division is often on that list, because I think, to your point, that expression of, we didn't have a word for saying depression, especially for men, at that time until much, much later. And this was something that spoke to people generationally over and over again through decades. Joy Division's lyrics and Ian Curtis kind of said that and expressed that for a lot of us in a lot of ways.
More now than at the time, and I saw them play in Blackpool where I grew up. There wasn't even 100 people at the gig, but pre-war, that's what you have to call it now, pre-war Russia. I went there quite a few times to music events. Russia's got an incredible music scene. You check out a band called, you want a band named Short Paris, there's a band to go and check out.
Okay.
A Russian bands who, they're not, I don't think they were called themselves a goth band, but you would like them if you like that kind of music. There's an industrial vibe to it. The singer sings in a really high voice. He's got a really beautiful voice. They have two drummers, and it's very sparse and very danceable. It's amazing band. They'd be really big now if the war hadn't started. They were just about to break out. Now they're stuck in Russia again. Very political as well. They do a lot of very anti-Putin stuff, but they can't do it now, obviously, because you just get chucked in jail. But they were doing these very great political videos. Amazing band. But so every band you would meet there was completely in awe of Joy Division. And these bands be 19, 20 years old. There's a really good dark electronic music underground scene in Russia. Just one person playing a laptop, making just really spooky music, and they're all mad into Joy Division. So when I went there, because they loved Manchester because of Joy Division. So of course, when you go there as being a music writer from Manchester, everybody wants to talk to you. It's like, oh, there's that guy from Manchester, and they adore Manchester. It's so sad that all this is gone because of that stupid sodding war, But so Joy Division's impact is almost delayed through the generations, So, like at the time, they were a cult band. It wasn't until Ian Curtis died they actually had a hit. I mean, Love Will Tear Us Apart was a posthumous hit for Joy Division. The albums didn't chart. They charted after he died. I mean, Closer was a top 10 album because his death was such a shock. It made them bigger, and it's what it took to make them big. And it was tragic that had to happen. Whereas now, if you were 19, I mean, these kids I met in Russia or at other places, they assume they were like you too. They think they were a stadium band. I have to explain to them they just played clubs. The biggest audience they played to was the last gig they ever played, which was in Birmingham. They played to about 400 people. That was the peak. This New Order got massive. It wasn't Joy Division. So, but their influence is enormous. And again, you cannot write a book about goth music and culture without putting Joy Division in. And some people like watching this will go, not Joy Division, they weren't goth, they didn't have the right hair, but musically their influence is all over it. The level of intensity and darkness they brought to the music, but also Martin Hannett's incredible production, genius production, which changed the sonics of how you made records, the sense of space in those records, the gaps between the instruments. It's not punk. I mean, one of the things I loved about punk was because it was so claustrophobic and everything's filled in. But one of the things I love about post-punk and Joy Division and a lot of goth music was way things empty, just the bass and the drums, and every instrument was playing lead at the same time. And somehow they mesh around each other. But you could actually argue that the Banshees' first album was the first album to do that, and the more you think about it, the more true that is, I mean, the two, especially the drums and the guitar, the two guys are not in the band after two albums. The drumming's amazing, isn't it? Like Kenny Morris's tribal drumming. I don't think there's a drummer who played like that before. I really can't think of one.
I think that had a lot to do with him too. And, I know I've heard all the horror stories of, like Stephen Moore, where he puts him up on a roof, alone and made him play for, hours and hours and hours on the snare doing it. Or where you brought up a while ago, Peter Hook, to me, changed the whole game with his bass style and bass playing. I mean, he really, truly, I think, as much as any prolific bass player in history, did something completely unique and changed, and a lot of people have done it since.
It's amazing because he has no idea how it happened. Because a lot of people kind of think, well, I did it because of this and this and this, and he'll go, I just play it and it comes out. And I don't know if you ever met, but you must see him do interviews. As a person, he's nothing like his bass lines. He's almost the opposite.
Right. I got to meet him once. I've seen Peter Hook in the Light many, many times, and I watched your interview with him, which was fascinating. I don't want to get off on a skew, but fascinating interview. Everyone should go check that out. The stuff about with the Rolling Stones and everything you did, and it just blew my mind. I had no idea, and I'm a huge Peter Hook guy, and I'd never heard that story.
Yeah, the idea that he couldn't play anybody else's songs, which is so post-punk, because everybody just picked up instruments and punk and just worked. You had to work it out yourself, so you'd have your own style. But you didn't really play covers, whereas bands before or after that period always learned loads of covers to learn the art of songwriting, which really is how you should do it. But we didn't know you meant to do it like that. You just go and get a bass or a guitar and you just sit there for days hitting it till something came out that sounded like music. And then basically that's what Hookie's done. He's just carried on playing like that. I don't think he really knows how about chords or scales. He just plays it all by ear, which a lot of people I know from that period, that's how they made music. And that, in a way, that's how the music became so idiosyncratic and so original.
Right.
Because people were actually just playing, they weren't actually playing what came out of them, weren't they? It was music from the subconscious. It wasn't really learned, was it? It was, and a lot of bands are like that. I mean, you listen, like another amazing musician who never gets any credit, Daniel Ash. I mean, his guitar playing at Bauhaus, is so original, and it's quite simple.
Even Love and Rockets and other, Tones on Tails, the other thing. You can always know a Daniel Ash riff. A lot like, I think, Johnny Marr, the same way. No matter what the project is, I hear it, and that sound is distinctive.
I mean, Johnny's different because Johnny worked it all out, and Johnny played loads of other people's songs. He's actually he's younger, so he's in the next generation when they start to learn songs again. And that's no critique of Johnny because he is an amazing guitar player and he did it the right way. But Daniel Ash was basically he just made noises that sounded great, with the ebow or his hand or just bending the neck. I mean, you can work his stuff out. He only plays about two chords or one chord in most of the songs. It's not hard to work out, but it's really hard to invent, to come up with in the first place. I mean, I'm always amazed. One of my favorite stories in Goth is the thing. Bauhaus's first rehearsal, they wrote Bela Lugosi's Dead, and 4 weeks later they recorded it, and that's a demo. The version that as the massive, timeless Goth classic.
The Hunger, everything, yeah.
It's just a demo of the song, but it was so good that they kept it, didn't they? I mean, they brought it out, didn't they, a couple of years ago? The 4 songs they did in that session. The other song's like some kind of weird reggae song. And then you got Bela Lugosi. They said, like Daniel Ash when I interviewed him, he said, like, when we put that together about 5 minutes flat and we all looked at each other and we'd all just started laughing because we just knew how good that was, Can you imagine just 30 minutes into your first rehearsal, you look at the drummer and go, what, he's young, isn't he, like Kevin that time? He couldn't do 2 beats. So he does his bossa nova beat with a floor kick drum. They put the bass line on, which is actually the Glitter Band, isn't it? Rock and Roll Part 1. And Daniel makes some weird dubby noises, and we give Peter Murphy the lyrics, and he just sings along to it. It took about 5 minutes to write, and to this day, it sounds amazing. I tell you, who does a really great version of it. It's Massive Attack. Have you ever heard their cover of it?
I have, yes.
It's ace, isn't it? Like to me, I would count Massive Attack as a modern version of Goth sets. especially
Sure.
when you get to some of the more recent. Mezzanine is a very dark record, and
Yeah.
when you speak to 3D, he's massively into that stuff. I mean, 3D's on record in interviews is saying that Bauhaus's Dark Dub or Blow Lugosi's Dead is basically partially what they were trying to do in Massive Attack,
Right. I
And
think a lot of that stuff, the whole kind of trip hop, 90s, Portishead, all of it, I think definitely has roots
captures the
and
atmosphere,
ties.
which is interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of modern goth bands use those trip hop beats as
Mhm.
their beats, don't they? So it fed back in round the other side, didn't it?
Greetings, all. It is I, Katie, the editor of Sounds and Shadows interviews. If you're enjoying this John Robb interview, I've got great news. We have more. There's going to be some other releases this week, so stay tuned on Wednesday and Friday for the second and third segments of this interview. Until then, keep it fucking dark, yo.